Welcome back to Irregular Mind. I'm so glad that you are here to continue our journey through the rich and often tumultuous history of America. In our last episode, we explored the cracks that began to form between Britain and its American colonies. We witnessed the shift in power and ideology from the principles of liberty in the English Bill of Rights to spiritual and intellectual awakenings that reshaped colonial society. We also followed the rise of tensions as Britain's tightening grip pushed the colonies closer to rebellion, from George Washington's early venture to the fallout of 7 Years' War. The seeds of defiance were planted, and the colonies were beginning to see themselves as something more than just an extension of the British crown. Today, we pick up the story as those seeds start to grow into full fledged resistance. The era of no taxation without representation is upon us, and the actions of Parliament will light the fuse that sets the colonies ablaze. Before we dive in, I have a quick favor to ask. If you are enjoying this podcast, please take a moment to follow, rate, and share Irregular Mind. Your support helps this podcast grow and keeps me motivated, bringing you more stories from history. And as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts, feedback, or questions. Don't hesitate to reach out. Now, let us dive into episode 6, where the revolution begins to simmer. Let us step back into mid 1700s, a time when the British government was desperate to recover from the enormous debt it had accumulated during the 7 Years' War. To do this, Parliament turned to these American colonies, deciding it was the time for them to contribute more into the empire's coffers. One of the first measures they introduced was the Sugar Act of 1764. Now, this wasn't just any tax. The Sugar Act was designed to reform and strengthen the old Molasses Act of 1733, which had placed a tax on molasses imported from non British colonies. The Molasses Act, though, had been widely ignored. Colonial merchants smuggled molasses with little interference, and enforcement was lax. Under the new law, the tax on foreign molasses was actually lowered. At first, this sounds like a win for the colonies, right? Not quite. The Sugar Act came with teeth. It has paired with strict enforcement measures designed to stop smuggling. British officials were now empowered to seize ships, inspect cargoes, and prosecute smugglers without the benefit of jury trials. This was a game changer for colonial merchants who had built their business on navigating and often bypassing trade restrictions. The act wasn't just about molasses either. It imposed tax on other goods like sugar, coffee, wine, and textiles, all of which were staples in colonial trade. For many colonies, the Sugar Act wasn't just a financial inconvenience, it was a direct threat to their way of life. Let us look into why this Sugar Act was such a big deal. After all, taxes were nothing new. The difference lay in who was imposing them and why. The colonies were used to governing themselves and taxing their own citizens through their local assemblies. Now, they were being taxed by a distant parliament in which they had no representations. To the colonies, this felt like an overreach and unwelcome intrusion into their autonomy. The Sugar Act also set off alarm bells for another reason. It wasn't just about raising revenue, it was about control. By cracking down on smuggling and increasing enforcement, Britain was tightening their grip on colonies, sending a clear message that who is the boss there. The Sugar Act didn't spark immediate widespread protest, at least not yet, but it planted the seeds of dissent. Merchants in particular felt the strain, and colonial leaders began to question what this new wave of taxation might mean for the future. This law was just the beginning of the Parliament's attempt to tighten its hold on the colonies. Soon, the protests that simmered under the Sugar Act would boil over when the British introduced another, even more provocative measure, the Stamp Act. And this time, it wouldn't just be the merchants who were angry. If the Sugar Act had started to stir the colonial frustration, the Stamp Act of 1765 brought it to a boil. This was the first direct tax imposed by Britain on American colonies. And it hit closer to home, literally. The Stamp Act required colonists to purchase special stamped paper for almost every type of legal document: marriage licenses, wills, newspapers, pamphlets, if it was printed. It needed a stamp. Even playing cards and dice were taxed, making the act not just a financial burden but a constant reminder of the British control. The remnants of this Stamp Act is still visible across the globe. Yes, For those who have seen a deck of playing cards can easily relate this. The British had long taxed playing cards back home, and this tradition carried over to the colonies with the Stamp Act. Each deck had to include a special tax stamp, typically printed on the ace of spades, which explains why that card often features ornated designs. These elaborated markings were a way for governments to signify that the tax has been paid, and over time, the ace of spades became the most iconic card in the deck. For the colonists, though, these symbols were anything but playful. They were visible reminders of British authority. Again, Stamp Act also wasn't just an economic inconvenience. It was deeply personal. For the first time, colonists of all walks of life felt the sting of British taxation. Lawyers were taxed for their legal documents, publishers on their newspapers, merchants on their shipping papers, even everyday entertainment like a game of cards was suddenly subject to loyal oversight. And this was the breaking point. Colonial leaders began to rally against the idea of taxation without representation. The principle that Parliament had no right to impose tax on colonies that had no voice in the decision making. Two figures emerged as vocal opponents of this Stamp Act: Samuel Adams in Massachusetts and Patrick Henry in Virginia. Henry's fiery speeches in the Virginia House of Burgesses, including his famous line, "If this be treason, make the most of it," galvanized the colonial resistance. Protests erupted across the colonies. In Boston, effigies of tax collectors were burnt in the streets. In New York, merchants organized boycotts of British goods. The Sons of Liberty, a secret group of patriots, took the fight directly to the British officials, intimidating stamp agents and tearing off offices. The backlash was so fierce that many stamp distributors resigned before they were ever sold a single stamp. The law became virtually unenforceable, and in 1766, under immense pressure, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. But the damage was already done. The colonists had tasted the unity in their resistance, and their distrust of British authority had only deepened. The Stamp Act left behind a critical legacy. It proved that collective action could force changes. It also introduced a new level of colonial defiance that would soon escalate. But Britain wasn't done yet. If the Stamp Act repeal was a retreat, it was only temporary. Parliament had more plans to assert its authority over the colonies, and next came another set of laws, the Townshend Acts. We spoke about two names. If the Stamp Act stirred unrest, it also brought forward some of the most influential voices of American Revolution. Two figures who would go on to shape the resistance against British rule: Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry. Let us start with Samuel Adams, a fiery patriot from Massachusetts. Adams was a skilled writer, an organizer, and relentless critic of British policies. He had a knack of rallying people, whether it was through his pamphlets, letters, or the gatherings he orchestrated in taverns and town halls. He helped form the Sons of Liberty, a secret group of patriots who took bold and at times radical actions to protest the British laws. From boycotts to public demonstrations, Adams was always in the thick of the resistance, turning frustration into collective action. Then there is Patrick Henry down south in Virginia. If Adams was the organizer, Henry was the orator. With his booming voice and passionate rhetoric, he could light the fire under any crowd. In 1765, as the Stamp Act loomed over the colonies, Henry delivered one of his most famous speeches in Virginia House of Burgesses. In it, he warned the crown of the consequences for overstepping its bounds, famously declaring, "If this be treason, make the most of it." His words electrified those around him and inspired a growing sense of defiance against British oppression. Together, Adams and Henry gave voice to the powerful idea that would echo through history: no taxation without representation. But what does that mean? To the colonists, it wasn't just a catchy slogan, it was a fundamental principle. They believed that only their own elected assemblies had the right to impose taxes on them. Parliament, thousands of miles away, might have power to make laws for Britain, but without colonial representatives in that body, it had no business taxing the colonies. From the colonial perspective, taxation without representation wasn't just unfair, it was a violation of their rights as English subjects. This belief wasn't new. It was rooted in centuries old traditions of British law. But now, with taxes like Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, the colonies felt those rights slipping away. This slogan, "No taxation without representation," became the rallying cry for a movement that was growing stronger by the day. It was repeated in town meetings, written in pamphlets, and shouted during protests. It united farmers, merchants, lawyers, and artisans under a shared sense of injustice. For Adams and Henry, this wasn't just about taxes, it was about self determination. They understood that these laws weren't just financial burdens, they were the direct challenge to colonial autonomy. The resistance they inspired helped turn scattered frustrations into cohesive movement, one that would continue to push back against British control at every turn. This defiance wasn't going unnoticed in London. Parliament wasn't just watching, it was preparing its next move, the series of laws that would take tensions between Britain and its colonies to the next level. Coming back to the point we left earlier, the Townshend Acts, may be a pivotal chapter in the US history. After the repeal of Stamp Act, tensions between Britain and the colonies simmered but didn't subside. Parliament, under the leadership of Charles Townshend, Chancellor of Exchequer, or kind of a finance minister, was determined to assert its authority over colonies. In 1767, it passed a new set of measures known as the Townshend Acts. It placed taxes on everyday items imported into colonies: glass, paper, paint, and perhaps most infamously, tea. The idea behind these acts was to raise revenue from the colonies to pay British troops stationed in America and to fund the salaries of colonial governors and judges. On the surface, this might seem like a practical move, but for the colonies, it was a direct attack on their autonomy. By using the tax revenue to fund officials loyal to the crown, Britain was stripping the colonies of their ability to hold those officials accountable. To make matters worse, the Townshend Acts also reinforced measures to crack down on smuggling. Customs agents were given more power, and writs of assistance, essentially blanket search warrants, allowed British officials to enter homes and businesses without specific cause. This wasn't just a tax, it was a direct intrusion into the lives and the livelihoods of colonists. How did the colonists respond? With growing outrage, boycotts of British goods became a popular form of resistance, spearheaded by groups like the Sons of Liberty and supported by ordinary citizens who refused to buy the taxed items. In addition to boycotts, colonial women played a significant role in the resistance through Daughters of Liberty. They spun their own cloth and brewed homemade teas, making a powerful statement for self reliance and defiance. Meanwhile, tensions between colonists and British soldiers began to escalate. Towns like Boston became hotbeds of unrest, where the presence of British troops only fueled resentment. The acts that were meant to enforce order were, in fact, breeding chaos and uniting the colonies against their common oppressor. Under increasing pressure from boycotts and protests, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend taxes in 1770. Most, not all. The tax on tea remained, a symbolic gesture to assert Britain's right to tax the colonies. This would prove to be a costly mistake. The Townshend Acts showed that the colonists' resistance wasn't just about money, it was about principle. They weren't fighting to save a few shillings or imported goods. They were fighting for their right to govern themselves and to live free of arbitrary rules. This chapter of story ends with the fragile calm, but it wouldn't last long. The lingering tax on tea would lead to one of the most infamous events in American history, the Boston Tea Party. But before that, tensions would explode on the streets of Boston, leaving blood in the snow and further dividing Britain and its colonies. In 1770, Boston was a city that was on the edge. British soldiers, what the colonists called redcoats, had been stationed in the city to enforce the Townshend Acts and maintain order, but their presence only fueled resentment. To the colonists, these soldiers weren't protectors, they were a standing army sent to suppress them in their own towns. Daily life in Boston had become a tinderbox of frustration. Soldiers and colonists clashed regularly in the streets, exchanging insults and sometimes fists. Tensions ran high, and it was only a matter of time before things turned deadly. On the chilly evening of March 5, 1770, a group of angry colonists gathered near the custom house on King Street. What started as a small protest quickly escalated. The crowd hurled insults, and soon snowballs, ice, and rocks at a small group of British soldiers standing guard. Amid the chaos, the soldiers, overwhelmed and frightened, opened the fire on the crowd. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead, including Crispus Attucks, a man of African and indigenous descent who is often remembered as the first casualty of American Revolution. News of the event spread like wildfire, and the colonists were outraged. The Boston Massacre became a symbol of British tyranny and the colonists' growing sense of injustice. But here is where it gets interesting. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was also a moment of strategic messaging. Enter Samuel Adams and other colonial leaders who wasted no time framing the event as a brutal and unprovoked attack on innocent civilians. Paul Revere's now famous engraving of Massacre depicted redcoats firing into a peaceful crowd, a powerful piece of propaganda that stoked colonial anger and united people against British rule. On the British side, the soldiers involved were put on trial. In a surprising twist, their defense attorney was none other than John Adams, Samuel Adams' cousin and a staunch patriot himself. Adams believed that even enemies deserved a fair trial, and his defense succeeded in acquitting 6 of the 8 soldiers. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter, but their punishment was too light. They were branded on their thumbs and sent on their way. This was not the first massacre by redcoats, nor the last. In April 1919, another British officer issued a firing order, killing around 1,500 innocent civilians, including women and children, and injuring a same number. When an Indian hears the word massacre, the first name that comes to mind is Jallianwala Bagh massacre. While the trial tempered some of the immediate outrage, the damage was already done. The Boston Massacre further deepened the divide between Britain and its American colonies. The massacre reinforced the feeling that British soldiers patrolling their streets were not there to protect them, but to enforce the will of the distant parliament. And as tensions mounted, the stage was set for the next act of defiance, a protest so audacious it would send shockwaves across the Atlantic. The Boston Tea Party. With this tragic event of Boston Massacre, I'll wrap up this episode. But this is only part of the story. In our next episode, we'll pick up with the dramatic events of Boston Tea Party and the intolerable acts, the revolutionary ideas sparked by Thomas Paine's common sense. The colonies are on the brink of declaring their independence, and you won't want to miss what happens next. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to follow, rate, and share this. It's the best way you can support us. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay curious, stay passionate, and I'll see you soon on Irregular Mind.